July 3rd, 1969. The fire support base looked secure in the way only a map can make something look secure. From above, it was a neat circle of sandbags and wire sitting on a low ridgeline, artillery pieces at the center, infantry dug in around them like a protective shell. On the ground, under the heat and the dust, it felt less solid, too temporary, too exposed. We had built it fast because speed mattered more than perfection, and now roughly 130 American soldiers depended on that speed to keep them alive. I was the company commander responsible for the perimeter. By late afternoon, I walked the defensive line the way I always did, slow, deliberate, saying little. I checked the wire tension, the cleared fields of fire, the positions of the machine guns. Everything looked correct. That was what bothered me. Experience had taught me that the enemy rarely challenged what was obviously strong. They went after habits instead, routine, complacency, the small assumptions that grew over time. We had been in this position long enough for routine to settle in. By early evening, the heat began to ease, but the jungle beyond the wire stayed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no distant movement, just a dark wall of vegetation waiting for night. Twilight was always the most dangerous time. Too much light to relax, not enough to see clearly. Guards strained their eyes, searching for shapes that blended into shadow. Our defensive posture was solid, but not perfect. Claymore mines were in place, though not everyone was armed. Listening posts had been pulled closer over the past week. There had been no contact, no probes, no harassment. Higher headquarters saw that as a good sign. I saw it as a warning. Silence in Vietnam was rarely accidental. As darkness settled in, the generators kicked on and the base took on a dull yellow glow. Inside the perimeter, men ate, cleaned weapons, wrote letters. Outside, the jungle disappeared completely. The wire marked a boundary we trusted more than we should have. What we didn't know was that the enemy had already started moving hours earlier. Not in large numbers. Not with noise or haste. Small teams, lightly equipped, trained to move low and slow, using the terrain we thought we had cleared. Their goal wasn't to attack the base head-on. It was to reach the places we least expected them to be. From my position near the command bunker, I could see most of the perimeter. Guards were alert, scanning outward. No one was looking inward. No one was thinking about how a base like this could be dismantled piece by piece, quietly, before a single shot was fired. At 1912, full darkness set in. The jungle pressed closer, swallowing sound and distance. The base felt smaller now, tighter. I remember thinking that the night felt heavier than usual, like something waiting just beyond reach. Somewhere outside the wire, men were already counting steps, memorizing shadows, timing our movements. And inside the base, we were still trusting the defenses we could see, unaware that the real danger had already begun to slip through the ones we couldn't. By the time the first guard shift changed, the base had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Footsteps moved along familiar paths, voices stayed low. Radios crackled softly with routine check-ins. From the command bunker, I could hear the distant clink of metal as artillery crews adjusted their guns for the night, more out of habit than expectation. Nothing in the soundscape suggested danger. That in itself was the danger. At around 20:05, one of the perimeter sentries reported a disturbance near the outer wire on the eastern sector. Nothing clear, just the sense that something wasn't right. A shadow where there hadn't been one before. The report was calm, professional. I acknowledged it and told him to stay alert. No flares, no movement orders. We had learned not to react too aggressively to uncertainty. Overreaction created patterns the enemy could exploit. What I didn't know then was that the disturbance wasn't a probe. It was the tail end of a movement already completed. The enemy had approached low using drainage ditches and dead ground we thought had been neutralized. They avoided the wire where it was thickest, choosing instead a section where the terrain forced us to thin it out for practical reasons. There were no explosions, no sudden noises, just hands working patiently in the dark, cutting, lifting, easing metal aside without letting it sing. Inside the base, time kept moving normally. Men joked quietly. Someone laughed. A cigarette flared briefly, then disappeared. All the small signs of a unit that believed the perimeter still belonged to it. At 2017, I felt the first real shift, not through sound, but through absence. One of the routine radio calls didn't come through on time. When it finally did, the voice was steady but too measured. That was something you only noticed if you had listened to the same men speak for weeks. I asked a follow-up question. The answer came back correct, but delayed. I began to walk again, this time without announcing myself. I wanted to see what the base looked like when it wasn't expecting inspection. Faces turned as I passed, postures straightened. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the sense of enclosure had grown stronger. The darkness felt closer to the sandbags than it should have. The enemy had not fired a shot. They had not revealed themselves. They were already doing something far more effective, compressing our awareness, narrowing our attention to what we could see and hear, while they moved through what we assumed was empty space. At 2026, a faint metallic sound reached me from somewhere near the artillery pit. Not loud enough to alarm anyone else, just enough to register. I stopped and listened. It didn't repeat. That worried me more than if it had. I ordered a quiet alert. No lights, no flares, no sudden movement. Platoon leaders acknowledged. Weapons were checked again. Men shifted slightly in their positions, careful not to break the illusion of normalcy. If the enemy was inside the perimeter, I didn't want them to know we suspected it. What we were facing wasn't an attack in the way American units usually understood the word. It was a dismantling, a methodical effort to remove key pieces before the whole structure collapsed. The wire had been breached without us noticing. Observation had been compromised without a fight. Control was slipping in increments too small to measure easily. Standing there in the darkness, I realized the enemy wasn't trying to overwhelm us with force. They were testing how long it would take us to understand that the base was no longer ours. And the most dangerous part was that, even now, many of my men still believed the night was under control. The first detonation came from the far side of the base, sharp and contained, like the ground itself had cracked. For half a second, no one moved. Not because we were frozen, but because the sound didn't match expectation. It wasn't the rolling thunder of incoming artillery or the chaotic noise of a firefight. It was precise, intentional, close. Training took over immediately. Men dropped, weapons came up, radios came alive all at once. I was already moving toward the artillery pit when the second blast followed, slightly deeper this time, accompanied by a sudden flare of light that briefly painted the interior of the base in harsh white. Shadows jumped across sandbags and disappeared just as quickly. This was no longer preparation. This was execution. The enemy had waited until they were exactly where they needed to be. Reports flooded in, overlapping, fragmented. One gun crew down. Communications disrupted in one sector. Confusion about where the contact actually was. That last part told me everything. The attack wasn't directional. It was internal. They weren't outside the wire anymore. They were among us, moving faster than information could travel. I forced myself to slow down. Panic spreads faster than gunfire in confined spaces. I started issuing short, clear commands, repeating them until I heard them echoed back. Sectors, accountability. No independent movement. Anyone not actively engaged was to lock down their position and hold. The enemy fire came in short, violent bursts, not sustained, not wasteful. They struck, disappeared, then struck again somewhere else. They weren't trying to occupy ground. They were tearing holes in our structure, command, fire support, coordination. At some point, I realized they had mapped the base better than we had. They knew where the guns were. They knew where the command bunker sat. They knew which paths we used at night and which areas we assumed were safe because nothing ever happened there. That knowledge didn't come from tonight. It came from patience. I reached the artillery area just as another charge went off nearby, close enough to knock me off balance. Dirt and debris rained down. Men shouted for medics. I ignored everything that wasn't directly in front of me and focused on restoring some form of control. The guns that could still function were ordered to prepare for defensive fire, but only on command. Blind firing would only make the chaos worse. The enemy wanted noise, confusion, overreaction. I refused to give it to them. Somewhere in the dark, small groups of attackers were already pulling back, slipping away the same way they had come in. They had achieved their objective. They had shown us that the base could be penetrated, that our defenses were not absolute, that safety here was conditional and temporary. As the firing tapered off and the night began to settle again, uneasily, unnaturally, I took stock of what remained. The base was damaged but still standing. We were bloodied, shaken, but not broken. That mattered. What mattered more was the realization that settled in afterward. We had not been attacked because the enemy wanted to destroy us completely. We had been attacked to remind us that nowhere in this war was ever truly secure. Dawn came slowly, like it was reluctant to show us what the night had done. As the light crept over the perimeter, the damage became clearer and more unsettling. Craters were small but perfectly placed. Sandbag walls collapsed inward, not outward. The command trench had been breached at its weakest angle, the one we'd reinforced the least because it sat in a natural dip we assumed offered protection. Assumptions are dangerous things in this war. I walked the base methodically, notebook in hand, forcing myself to see everything through a tactical lens instead of an emotional one. Shock clouds judgment. Analysis restores it. Casualty numbers were lower than they could have been, which told me something important. The attackers had exercised restraint. Their goal wasn't mass casualties, it was paralysis. They had struck the nerve centers, artillery, communications, command flow, then vanished before we could respond decisively. That meant this wasn't a random raid. It was reconnaissance by fire, executed by men who understood our layout, our routines, even our reaction times. We gathered the platoon leaders near the artillery pit, the one gun still operational, standing like a wounded animal. I laid out what we knew and, more importantly, what we didn't, where the charges had been placed, the timing between detonations, the pattern of fire, short engagements, deliberate withdrawal, no pursuit allowed during the attack. That last point wasn't an accident, it was discipline. The enemy force was small, likely no more than a reinforced sapper element, maybe 12 to 15 men, light weapons, satchel charges, wire cutters, nothing heavy. They didn't need heavy weapons. The base itself was the weapon once they got inside it. We reviewed our own failures just as bluntly. Overconfidence in the wire. Predictable sentry rotations. Noise discipline so lax that a man could cough in one bunker and be heard 2 positions over. The enemy didn't overpower us. They slipped through the gaps we convinced ourselves didn't matter. By mid-morning, higher command was already asking questions. How had they penetrated the perimeter? Why hadn't early warning picked them up? Were we certain the attackers had withdrawn completely? I answered carefully, not defensively. Defensiveness hides truth. No, we could not be certain they were gone. That was the most dangerous part. The rest of the day passed in forced normalcy. Repairs, recounting equipment, resetting sectors, but every movement felt heavier now. Every shadow seemed intentional. Men spoke less. When they did, it was quieter, as if volume alone might invite another attack. I noticed it most in the younger soldiers, the ones who had arrived weeks ago expecting clear lines, obvious threats, and visible enemies. The night had stripped those illusions away. In their place was something more useful, but harder to live with: constant alertness. That evening, as darkness returned, we adjusted everything. Trip flares repositioned, listening posts doubled, overlapping fields of fire redesigned not for an external assault but for an internal breach. The base was no longer a safe island. It was contested ground, even when empty. As I stood on the perimeter just after sunset, rifle resting against the sandbags, I understood something that doesn't show up in after-action reports. The attack hadn't just damaged equipment or shaken morale. It had changed how we thought. From that night on, we didn't ask if the enemy could reach us. We assumed they already had, and planned accordingly. Night settled in again, heavier than the one before. No flares went up, no probes touched the wire. And that silence was more unnerving than the explosions. A skilled attacker knows when not to strike. After a successful raid, restraint is power. It forces the defender to exhaust himself fighting shadows. I ordered staggered rest cycles, shorter than doctrine recommended. Fatigue dulls reaction time, but predictability kills faster. Men slept with boots on, rifles across their chests, fingers unconsciously hooked through trigger guards. Nobody complained. The night before had taught them the cost of comfort. Around 2,300 hours, one of the listening posts reported movement. Faint, irregular. Not the careless noise of patrols. Something deliberate. Slow. Testing. I didn't call artillery. That would have been exactly what they wanted. A flare of panic, wasted fire missions, empty tubes if they came again. Instead, we watched. Minutes stretched. Sweat ran down spines despite the cooling air. Then, nothing. The movement faded the way it had come, like a hand withdrawing after checking if a door was locked. They were still nearby. That confirmed my suspicion from the morning. The first attack hadn't been the point. It was the lesson. They wanted us tense, reactive, burning energy. A base that can't sleep can't think, and a base that can't think will eventually make mistakes. Just before dawn, I gathered the NCOs again. Quiet voices. No dramatics. We adjusted once more, not just defenses, but mindset. We stopped thinking in terms of perimeter and started thinking in terms of penetration. Any position could already be compromised. Any shadow could belong to someone who knew our routines better than we did. At first light, reconnaissance patrols pushed out cautiously, not to chase, but to confirm patterns. Cut vegetation here. Footprints erased there. Signs of careful withdrawal. The enemy hadn't lingered, but they hadn't fled either. They had left on their terms. By late morning, helicopters thumped in with resupply and a brief visit from battalion. They talked metrics, damage reports, kill ratios. I listened, answered, nodded when required. But my focus was elsewhere, on the men moving around the base, how they scanned before stepping, how conversations stopped when unfamiliar sounds carried on the wind. The base still stood. Guns still fired, orders still flowed. But something fundamental had shifted. The enemy hadn't needed to overrun us. They hadn't needed to hold ground or raise flags. They had proven a simpler truth, that no amount of sandbags or firepower could guarantee control. Only vigilance could delay loss. As evening approached again, I wrote the day's final notes. Not for headquarters, for myself. The most effective attack is the one that convinces your enemy the fight never really ends. That night, as darkness returned for the third time since the raid, we were ready. Not because we felt safe, but because we no longer believed safety was real. And in this war, that belief might be the only thing keeping us alive.